Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, standardized tests, what we can learn from them, and what role they should play in our schools with Washington Post Homeroom columnist Karin Chenoweth. The census. Who are we? And what might it mean for our cultural and political futures? On musical traditions, the powerful pen and voice of Terry Allard, plus Alilia Bundles drops by Writer's Block to talk about her biography of Madam C.J. Walker, legendary African-American entrepreneur and philanthropist. Poetry by DJ Renegade, and Angela Boykin and Carolyn Joyner perform the poetry of newly emancipated slaves. And the weekend traveler takes a train ride to paradise. Grab a pencil and paper and take your seats. It's test time. For 8th graders in Maryland, it must seem like it's always test time, because on top of exams for coursework, 8th graders also take the week-long MSPAP, Maryland School Performance Assessment Program test at the beginning of May. President Bush wants all 8th graders in the country to take another standardized test, the Comprehensive Test of Basic Skills. And some who were 8th graders back in 1999 took the TIMSS test, which measured student performance against global competition. TIMSS stands for the Third International Mathematics and Science Study. A representative sample of 8th graders in 38 countries took the 1999 version of the test, and so did students in 13 states, including Maryland, and 14 local districts, including Montgomery County. Here's a math question from the exam. You've got a rectangle inside a parallelogram. What's the area of the shaded rectangle? Come on, this is elementary geometry. Well, while you rack your brain for the formula, let's ask Karin Chenoweth, who writes the Homeroom column for the Washington Post, how many 8th graders got this question right, and what we really hope to accomplish with all this testing. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you. Well, about 34% of Maryland 8th graders got that right, which is comparable to the rest of the United States. Montgomery County, about 43, I think, percent got that right, which is 20 centimeters squared.
And we got that by multiplying 5 against 4?
Yes.
Okay. When you look at Maryland and Montgomery County, you gave me the numbers for how the kids did. How did they stack up against the world?
Well, in Singapore, about 83% of the kids got that one right, which demonstrates that in the United States, we really push off geometry. We don't teach much geometry until kids are much later in high school than elsewhere in the country, in the world, where they incorporate geometry much more closely into the curriculum.
Well, why are we taking a test? Why are our kids taking a test on subject matter that they haven't studied to be compared to kids elsewhere who have studied this material?
Well, it's just, what do our kids know in math? What do our kids know in science? If you ask a kid, can you filter out a solution, the items in a solution, do kids know what that means? Do they have any sense of whether human beings lived at the time of dinosaurs? These are questions that get to sort of scientific literacy, mathematic literacy, and it would probably be unfair not to ask some geometry questions, since Singapore teaches geometry. Why not ask some geometry questions? Is there a reason not to teach some geometry to younger kids?
TIMSS also examined kids in science, and you alluded to one of the questions that was on that exam, so maybe we'll take a look at that question right now. 8th graders were questioned about a filtering system that could separate materials, and they were asked to figure out from this diagram what you could filter out.
Right. And part of what you need to know is what a mixture is and what a solution is. Mm-hmm. A solution, all the material is, I'm not very scientifically competent to discuss this, but basically you can't filter items out of a solution the way you can a mixture.
Because they've all become
one.
They've
all become one,
right.
Exactly.
And when do kids in the United States learn about this?
Well, some never do.
Mm-hmm. When should they be learning about it? According to the general curriculum,
We don't have a general curriculum.
Oh, that's right. Well, in Maryland.
Now, shall we talk about that?
Why don't we talk about that a little bit? It does seem odd to me, frankly, that we're comparing our kids to kids who have studied this body of information on the one hand, and two, it seems that the critical piece of information to extract from these tests is that either the kids elsewhere are studying too much too early, or we're studying too little too late, or maybe not at least at the same rate.
Or get some idea of what's possible. When the MSPAPs first came in, the Maryland State Performance Assessment Tests, which are given to 3rd, 5th, and 8th graders. The first couple of years, there were just screams from teachers all over the state saying it's not developmentally appropriate. No 3rd grader in the world could do this. No 5th grader in the world could do this. Well, they gave the test to some 5th graders in Taiwan and found out, sure enough, they could do it. We don't even really have a good sense in that way of how much kids can learn and what we can ask of them. And not to put the screws to them, not to make their lives miserable, but to enlarge their lives so that they are more competent to go out and figure out what they want to do. How many college graduates do we really want wandering around going, gee, I don't know what I want to do?
Well, the MSPAP intentionally is attempting to gauge not so much individual student performance, but how the schools are performing. Isn't that right? And is that what we're able to learn as well from the TIMSS test?
To some extent, yes, we can, and that's what's very interesting. We can learn all kinds of things from. There are all kinds of surveys that have been done as part of these international studies. For example, they videotaped 8th grade math lessons in Japan, Germany, and the United States, and one of the things that was so fascinating was that when Japanese teachers looked at the videotapes of American classrooms, they were stunned, and they forced the group to stop them. What was that? They said, and the Americans didn't know what they were talking about. And so they went back, they replayed the tape, and it was a bus announcement, or it was a lunchtime announcement, or the Japanese teachers were astounded by these videotapes. Who would interrupt a math lesson, they asked. Oh, that happens all the time. So simply by paying attention to what it is that other countries do, we can get a better sense of what we do. The American researchers never even noticed the bus announcements.
Another issue seems to be the question of how well our teachers are prepared to teach math and science. Talk a little bit about that.
Maryland teachers, less than half of Maryland math 8th grade teachers have either majored in math or math education, and yet I think something like 90% feel very confident that they can teach 8th grade math. Around the world, this is taken as a sign that they don't understand how complicated 8th grade math is. And to a mathematician, 8th grade math is not that complex, and yet each piece of it links up in some way to much more complex math. And to teach it properly, you really have to have an understanding, a very deep understanding of fundamental mathematics, what one academic calls profound understanding of fundamental mathematics.
Again, back to the learning side. Home resources, income level of families.
Very powerful effects.
How does that correlate?
Very highly, around the world actually. For the most part, high home resources, which includes sometimes very simple things like having a desk at home, having an encyclopedia, a dictionary, a quiet place, some quiet to study. Those are considered home resources. But in addition, having a college-educated parent, having all kinds of things like that are very highly correlated with.
Yeah, the instance of Singapore and Korea, which were both high-scoring countries, if you can call Singapore a country, the opposite was true. They were at the bottom of the home resource support graph.
And I think what that proves is that Singapore, which leads the world in math and is close to leading the world in science, has managed somehow to figure out how to compensate for that.
So it can be done
It can be done. Absolutely,
if the
it can be
resources
done.
are put.
It can be done, and this is
to
one
use
of
in
the
the schools.
dangers of always talking about this the achievement gap. Yes, there's an achievement gap. It's a devastating achievement gap, but between whites and blacks, rich and poor. It's not an act of nature. This is an act of
Policy.
policy.
And another act of policy is how long the school day is and how long the school year runs. How does that compare?
Well, it varies around the world, and I don't think there's a sharp correlation. Japan, we know a fair amount about Japan. They have a longer school day, a longer school year, but the kids are not in class as much as American kids. What you do with the time is more important than how much time you have in many ways, which is not to say it's important to have more time. If you need the time, you should have the time. But the time doesn't seem to be correlated exactly.
Okay. I heard recently on Morning Edition, the NPR program, one of the Car Talk brothers did a commentary on Morning Edition, and what he was saying is he went to his daughter's open house, and she's in junior high school, and it was all focused on high math. And he said, well, and I thought about this, and it was true for me too, that since he's taken algebra and geometry, he's never used any of this coursework at all, except to perform better at a higher level of math in school, but he's never used it outside of school. Are we placing too much emphasis on higher math generally?
Well, you could make that argument. You could base things solely on verbal manipulations and ability to manipulate verbally, but that's not the way the country seems to be going. That's the way our generation thinks, quite honestly. But I was talking to I was talking to Freeman Hrabowski, who heads University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and he was talking about all the high-tech companies around the state of Maryland, around the country, who ship their work out overnight, and it comes back by email overnight, and they ship it out because there aren't enough technologically proficient people here in the United States to do the work. We have to import our technology workers. We have to export our technological work. This is a disaster for us. And, you know, do you need algebra? Yeah, it's the language of symbolic manipulation. Yes, you do. It's a language. You have to learn it. It's like Spanish or French.
Well, I have to manipulate the end of this segment, I'm afraid. Thanks to Washington Post columnist Karin Chenoweth for joining us in the coffee house. Still to come, what the census tells us about who we are. The Voice, singer-songwriter Terry Allard with harmonica whiz Gary Green. Lelia Bundles on Madam C.J. Walker, poetry by D.J. Renegade, and poetry from newly emancipated slaves. But first,
Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. A relaxed hour-and-a-half drive from Baltimore. You probably know it as Amish Country, and that alone makes for an interesting visit, at least for grown-ups. But in the heart of Lancaster County sits the town of Strasburg, and its appeal spans the generations.
It is the densest concentration of railroad attractions in North America.
Trains, 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 including America's oldest short-line railroad.
All aboard. If you have already done so, please take your ticket off the privilege stop and train when it comes through your coach. Thank you.
It runs from Strasburg to Paradise. Paradise, Pennsylvania. Past Amish and Mennonite farms. And ghosts of trains past. and back in a kid-friendly 45 minutes. Across the street from the Strasburg Railroad, a chance to wander through a collection of over 100 locomotives and rail cars and feel the power of the railroad age. The fun is only beginning. How about toy trains manufactured back in the 1800s? And toy trains being built today. It's a vast, nearly priceless collection founded on trains donated by members of the Train Collectors Association.
Over the years, the value of trains changes. Some sizes will go up in value while other sizes decrease in value. We really couldn't put a price on our collection. But I would say that if you're going to try and assemble a collection like this on the open market today, you probably, unless you're Bill Gates, probably would not have enough money.
Happily, the cost to just visit the museum is quite reasonable. We're far from done with toy trains in Strasburg. How about an exquisitely designed labor of love? 50 years in the making. It's trains and much more. A 1,700 square foot layout, a depiction of Strasburg and Americana. Where to stay? There are all sorts of bed and breakfasts and inns in the Lancaster area, but for the true railroad buffs and for kids of all ages, it's got to be the Red Caboose Motel. Some 50 remodeled cabooses from parts near and parts far, with plenty of diversions for the younger set. And the motel is priced to meet all budgets. For the Weekend Traveler, I'm Chuck Barber.
Hi, and welcome to a second look at the Coffee House. It's a national tradition to take a second look at who we are and where we are going every 10 years. We call it the census. From the census numbers come an understanding of social trends. We now know that in the suburbs around Washington, once largely filled with white people, there's a new diversity. But what does this mean? And what else is going on in our region, demographically speaking? Robert Lang is the Director of Urban and Metropolitan Research at Fannie Mae Foundation, and he's been studying the numbers. Hi, welcome to the Coffee House.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, let's start with this new diversity. We're talking about people of color moving into the suburbs. Is this a phenomenon of immigration, a phenomenon of people fleeing the cities?
We don't know specifically yet. We have an idea. Depends on the region. In some places it's new immigrants. In other areas it's people who used to live in the cities, moved out, creating diversity in the suburbs.
What about here?
In Washington, D.C., it's an interesting case. Washington, D.C., compared to the rest of the metropolitan area, is a fairly modest city. It's a very big, sprawling metropolitan area. And it doesn't represent that big a city as a catchment area for new immigration like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles do. So in the case of Washington, D.C., you have a lot of migration directly from outside the country to places like Northern Virginia, for example, Arlington.
So there's just no place to find in the big city, so you go to the outside.
There's a limited amount of places to find in the big city. It's not to say Washington's not getting immigration, it is. It's just that it's not Chicago or New York in terms of the numbers, or especially Los Angeles.
All right. What are the numbers like here? How big a trend is this?
In Washington, D.C. or nationally?
Well, okay, nationally.
Well, nationally the numbers are big in that most of the growth in the country, and this was a boom decade by any measure. This is the biggest year as percentage increase since the 1960s, and it's the most Americans ever added to the United States. And 4 out of 5 of those new citizens are non-white Hispanic, meaning they're not white.
They're not white. Exactly.
It's a technical definition, but
right.
it's...
No, I understand
yeah.
the point. All right, so and let's then bring it down to the Washington region. Also a big increase here.
Yes, it's a big increase here, especially in Northern Virginia. There was a big boom in the western suburbs out Loudoun County and so on. That's where the big percentage growth is. But there was also very strong growth in a place like Fairfax, Virginia, Fairfax County.
And Montgomery County, once
Maryland
white,
grew a little slower than Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
Northern Virginia is like that northern reach of the Sun Belt. It kind of reaches up to Washington. And you cross that Potomac and you start to get into the northeastern United States. And Maryland mimics more like a New Jersey growth rate, and Virginia looks more like the Carolinas.
Okay, all right. Now, politically, let's say, this new change going to have some immediate impact on the politics of the region?
I wouldn't say it's so much immediate as, for one reason, a lot of immigrants are too young to vote still. So it's going to take a census or two to have it really register. Because the immigrant population tends to be young.
Kids, yeah.
A lot of them are kids. In the city of Washington itself, one of the changes that's occurring is that within a census or two, there'll be no majority in Washington, D.C. So it'll be more like New York and Los Angeles in that way, where no one group is the majority in the city. And the politics will probably change accordingly.
So there'll be coalition politics, in a sense, at least when you speak racially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Depends on how much people identify with their group.
Right.
But yeah, it would shift that way, towards a kind of Los Angeles structure.
All right. How about neighborhood by neighborhood? Is there less integration or more integration?
Around the country, there's a way to measure the extent to which people are segregated by neighborhood. And the northeast Midwestern U.S. has actually numbers that are either in the same place as they were in the last census or going up slightly. The South and the West is more integrated in that regard. And Washington, D.C. is somewhere in the middle of that list.
Somewhere in there. Because I was struck the other day, George Bush had the Little League kids out on the lawn, and one team was essentially a white team, the other team a black team, reflecting the neighborhoods.
Well, there's a big issue. If you have diversity, do you also have integration with the diversity? Because you can have numbers of people living in the country and not occupying the same neighborhood.
Well, that's what I was trying to drive.
And you get a case in the case of Hispanics,
right.
you have such high numbers coming to the country that you get a phenomena where you get a bump typically when you run high immigration in some form of segregation, because you're coming to catchment areas, you're coming to neighborhoods that already exist, and you're adding extra households to those areas. So in a kind of statistical quirk, in some ways, you'll get the numbers to come up a little. And that's actually what the USA Today reported on a little while back, that the numbers for Hispanics.
Right, and you've been, I forgot to mention, you've been a consultant on the consensus for USA Today, right?
Yes.
Yes, so you're...
I saw the numbers as they came in.
That's right. You've been speaking nationally to a lot of people for a while on this. But what I'm wondering is there a phenomena where you've still got an inner city or a big city, black, a ring of immigrants from Latin America on the outer ring, and then the inner ring, and then the outer ring with white people?
Hardly any region is classically one way or another like that, in that ring phenomenon. You take Washington, D.C. You have whites beginning at 16th Street in the city and heading west and north and southwest out of the city into suburbs in Maryland and Virginia. And east of 16th Street, the metropolitan area is much more diverse, black and Hispanic. And so in Washington, you have both groups occupying the actual center of the city, and then in different lines spilling into the suburbs. So you don't always get that kind of,
that ring phenomenon.
Yeah, and the other thing is that a lot of the inner suburbs around the country are getting poorer, and they're having more minority population. And one of the issues is that these suburbs have limited capacity in some ways to deal with poverty. And because they don't have the big central city government, they can't go to Congress, they're not big city mayors.
Right.
They have limited ratables, and once they get past a certain point, they work off of, more or less local taxes off of land taxes.
Right, property taxes.
And after a while, you can really quickly max that out, and there's not these other sources of revenue. And there's not a whole poverty infrastructure to deal with it in the form of nonprofits and community development corporations and so on. So in a census or two, it may be that a lot of poverty is actually out of the traditional central city into this inner ring of suburbs, and in a place that traditionally has not coped with poverty in the past.
So the big cities are better off. And you said that, I think, when we were talking before, that Washington is more affluent now than
it was in 1990.
Yeah.
There's been a turnaround too in population in a lot of cities. That we took a look at cities that had at least a couple of declining decades in the last 50 years, and took a look at them as a group. So it included, Worcester, Massachusetts, that were a pretty good-sized city in the 1950s, and Providence, Rhode Island, and a whole host of cities like this, and looked at where they were now relative to where they've been in the past. And it just turns out that the 1990s were their best decade since the 1940s. They had, places that were declining, declined slower. Places that weren't supposed to grow, grew slightly. Places like New York did quite well. And so as a group, they actually, for the first time since World War II, gained population as a whole, which is remarkable.
Was some of that due to just the general prosperity? Folks had enough money to afford to live comfortably in the big city?
It's a diverse set of factors, but I'd say largely it's immigration, because you're bumping up the numbers. And what it is a lot of these cities, too, have a phenomena where you have families leaving and singles moving in. And singles can come in and actually occupy the same housing unit that somebody who was a family left, and the population can drop.
Right.
And it could seem like it's a population loss, but in fact it's just the loss of a family and the substitution of a single or married couple without children.
Yeah, inside the same household.
Inside the same household.
Right. Well, the overall numbers, how many do we actually have here in the Washington area, I guess, between... how do you...
Many. It's the fourth largest metropolitan area in the United States.
Right. What's the big number?
It's between Washington and Baltimore. It's number 4. You've got me cold on this.
Well,
I know the big ones. I know New York's 21 points, such and such, and Los Angeles is 16. It's behind Chicago. It's ahead of San Francisco.
Okay. So
and it's a very big region. When Baltimore was added in the mid-1990s to make it an integrated region, that's when it jumped ahead of other large regions like Philadelphia and San Francisco and became the 4th largest metro area in the U.S. And it's grown.
And it's growing. And that trend is going to continue as far as, because there is the space, if not inside Washington, outside.
Yeah. If you define the metropolitan area way down to Shenandoah, you've got a lot of room.
Right, got a lot
and
of
they
room. Do. And Northern Virginia going to continue as the big hot boomlet?
For now. These trends change over a lot of years, but yeah, it looks like Northern Virginia, again, seems more like the parts of the country that are growing very fast, the South and the West. It's not quite Phoenix or Atlanta, but it's, for the Northeast, certainly a fast-growing area.
Okay. Thank you. The census isn't just about numbers, of course. It's about people and social trends and political trends. It's about the status quo sometimes, but it's mainly about change. Thanks to Robert Lang of the Fannie Mae Foundation for helping us sort it out. I'm Howard Cohen, and this has been A Second Look.
One, acknowledgement. He awakens in a room dark as the inside of an egg, his heavy-veined hands searching for the light. Outside his window, sparrows sing to the rhythm of crickets. Yellow fingers crack the sky's black shell. He observes in awe as the sun's yoke bursts across the horizon and bird chirps spill over his windowsill. He assembles his sacks, prepares to practice. Once, he loved the sharp notes a needle played in his veins. Now his smoke-stung lungs seek to inspire a higher key. 2, resolution. If he turns his sax upside down, it curves like a question mark. What is the true measure of music? Notes vibrate at various frequencies. Some make one smile as if you'd received a compliment. Others cry as if you'd cut open your finger. One melody brings back your grandmother dozing in her favorite chair. Another, a childhood friend splashing in a muddy puddle. But which sustained chord will fill a beggar's cup with coins? Which major scale can halt an army of malignant cells? Which low note will rumble from thunderclouds? Every sunrise finds him searching for the solo to answer his questions. 3, pursuance. He grips the mouthpiece between his teeth, closes his eyes and tongues the reed, pursuing a riff as soothing as sun rays on his naked back. His sax reflects sound, collating chords into colors. The first B-flat floats like smoke from a locomotive, riding the silver rails of scales, past the signs of time signatures, around the sharp curves of a treble clef, down through a valley of verses, over an intricate bridge, seeking a riff elaborate as a lattice of lace, infinite as the list of all integers, a solo electric, a solo elusive, a solo psalmic, a solo supreme. 4. Psalm. His fingertips trek across the brass tracks of his tenor sax. Riding 3 rails as one, he clucks his tongue, flicking sweat from the sweet neck of sound. As he solos, the sun covers him in a plush robe of light until he finds this riff, shining bright as the name of the Lord on the lips of a kneeling child.
Change and spare parts, an everlasting longing in my heart. Shoot blanks in the dark. What's the chance I'll ever hit my mark? I had it all. I had it all when love was new. But now I find I'm just getting by on a little bits and pieces of love I get from you. Loose change and spare parts, the sad remains of Cupid's mislaid dart. You stay and you play the part, a shadow of the man who stole my heart. Shumba, 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 ba. I had it all. Getting by on a little bits and pieces of love I get from you. Loose change and spare parts. Love was not a promise but a lark. Is this fate's game? This sad remark, rattling all around inside my heart, rattling all around inside my heart. Ooh.
Well, that was nice.
Thank
Welcome,
you.
Terry. Welcome,
Hi,
Gary.
hi. Thank you.
Nice to have you here on the Coffee House. Let me guess, the name of that was Loose Change and Spare Parts.
Yes.
Okay.
Very good, David.
Thank you, thank you. I listened carefully. I notice you're holding the guitar a little higher than usual.
Yes,
Can we get a profile shot here?
We have a trio tonight.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so when you heard that it's a good idea to play music for your kid while they're on the way, you took that to heart. So
Yeah, I'll
right.
kill two birds with one stone.
When did you guys first start playing together? I don't mean tonight. I mean, right.
It's been, I think, about a little over 4 years now.
4 to 5.
That went kind of fast. But we've been playing, we're based outside of the Charlottesville, Virginia area. And I'd been hearing Gary for years, but we'd never really had an opportunity to play together. And one night I was doing one of my regular gigs in town, and it was late, and no one was there, and I was so bored, and I had to stay. And he walked in, and I said, "Do you have your harmonicas?"
Right.
And he said, "Yes." I said, "Oh, please come save me."
Cool.
We played together, and then by the second song I said, "I have a gig at the Birchmere on Tuesday, what are you doing?"
Wow.
And he came and opened with me at the Birchmere.
What were you doing before in your own band then?
Working with blues acts and things like that. And it's a real treat to play this melodic, pretty stuff, and we've been doing it for a while now.
Now, I always hear a lot of jazz influences when I hear you play. How long? How long have you been sort of playing harp?
73.
Wow. Wow.
Ask him why he started to play.
Why did you start to play? It's a good thing I brought her along here.
Well, any young adolescent man, young boy, whatever, gets to play any instrument.
Chicks.
All right.
Sorry.
Good.
I love that.
All right.
But he's so good now. You know, it's a good thing.
With
it's
the
a good-
chicks.
yeah. Well,
Right.
I don't know if you're going to get him in trouble.
All right, sorry.
These are puppy.
Right. Why don't you play us one more? What's it called?
I'm going to do Lifeline.
Another one you wrote.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Take it home. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Baby, I know you better than you know yourself, and all the foolish games you play. You never did quite get enough sweetness in your loving cup. So much emptiness remains. Go on and be with her if you think she'll satisfy some deep-rooted childhood need. But you will see in time, baby, I'm your one lifeline. I'm your anchor in this rough and reckless sea. All the ghosts that follow you, all the love you never knew, I was sent here just to save you. Baby, I know you better than you know yourself, and you can't find a way to choose. So many times before you faced a slamming door, now you don't have the heart to lose. Oh, how would I survive? Baby, I'm your one lifeline, and it's you I'm here to save. Oh, it's you I'm here to save.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. A biography is considered complete if it merely accounts for 6 or 7 selves, whereas a person may well have as many thousand, wrote Virginia Woolf. She was referring to the complexity of real life and her challenge as a novelist to replicate it. But the biographer today is faced with a similar challenge. Historical details are only one side of the story. The biographer must reveal the many faces of the subject and do it in a compelling way. And what happens when the biographer is also related to the subject, descendant to those thousand selves? Isn't the writing all the more complicated? Author Alelia Bundles is up to the task. She writes about her great-great-grandmother in her new book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. Her story is a detailed, heavily researched biography and a personal account from her own family tree. Alelia Bundles is the former Washington Deputy Bureau Chief for ABC News. She is the author of several essays and articles on Madam C.J. Walker, as well as a young adult book, Madam C.J. Walker, which received an American Book Award. She lives in Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Glad to be here.
So, did you always know you were going to write this book, since this was in your family?
Well, you know, I think I resisted it for a long time, but I was surrounded by things that had belonged to Madam Walker and her daughter, Alelia Walker, from childhood. And I was absorbing stories about these women. My mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, which made hair care products, which Madam Walker had founded. But I wanted to be a writer, and I became a producer, television producer, and I was going around the country telling all of these other stories, everybody else's story, where this great story was waiting on my closet shelves.
Mm-hmm. And it was your father who sort of led you there, and your grandfather?
My grandfather did. My mother's father, who was a wonderful, he was a lawyer, but he was also a sort of an amateur historian. And he had lots of great stories, but Madam Walker's secretary was my neighbor, a woman who had started working for her in 1916. There were a few other people who had known Madam Walker or her daughter who were part of my life. So I was hearing all kinds of stories about these ladies.
Well, and you must have gotten way beyond the typical story of the daughter of slaves who becomes a laundress, who then becomes the first black millionaire. All along, right? There were all these other...
There were the personal stories that I was hearing, that Madam Walker had developed a hair care product. That was something that many people knew about her, those who knew something about her at all. But most people didn't know anything about her because our history books didn't really include women and people of color when I was growing up. But I knew that she was a philanthropist, that she had been involved in the anti-lynching movement, that she was a political activist. And those were the stories that I really wanted to tell, how she had empowered other women.
Because this is a feminist story.
Very much so.
And could you talk a little bit about how she did that, how she got started?
Well, as you said, she was the daughter of slaves. She had very little education. She was widowed at 20 with a daughter to raise, no particular skills other than being a washerwoman and picking cotton. Her hair began to fall out, and she developed an ointment that contained sulfur that healed the scalp disease that she had, very common at the time. Her hair began to grow back. Other people wanted to know the secret. She began to sell the product. Now, she had lots of obstacles between discovering this and becoming a very wealthy woman who employed many people. But that was the beginning of her success. I think that after a point, the company became a means to an end. The wealth that she created became a means to an end to help other women. Around the time Mary Kay was born, Madam Walker was already having conventions, national conventions of her sales agents.
Wow, amazing. You also, there's so many cities that she lived in. She was in Louisiana, she was in Indiana, Denver, New York. And you talk about the history and what was going on. You have one story about Denver, Molly Brown, the woman who, and how, this is a similar story of a woman who came from nothing and suddenly became this, great millionaire.
I think that I had this sense of wanting to weave in all of these things that appeared to be disparate, but to try to find some connection. What could have inspired Madam Walker? And the truth was, Molly Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown, as we know from the Titanic, lived in Denver, had, like Madam Walker, been born in 1867 on the Mississippi River, but in Missouri rather than in Louisiana, and had become wealthy. And I saw some parallels between these women. Now, there's no way Madam Walker would have socialized with Molly Brown at that point in her life, but she could have walked past her house. And so I wanted to bring together all kinds of interesting American history stories. It's interesting how we intersect and don't really know that we do.
What she intersected with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and Mary McLeod Bethune, and you talk about Booker T. Washington snubbing her at one point, and I wondered if it was because she was a woman. It's sort of implied that people look down on her for straightening hair, but was it more than that?
Well, Booker T. Washington was the most powerful black man in America at the time. This is 1912. And Madam Walker was just really coming into her own, and she wanted his endorsement. She didn't agree with him on all his politics, but she thought if she had recognition from him at his annual National Negro Business League convention, that it would help her sell more products and therefore employ more people. And Washington did snub her. She wasn't part of his inner circle. He was used to being in control. He was also a bit of a sexist. There's no question about it. But I think he was keeping her at arm's length. She didn't really owe him anything. He liked to pull the strings, and he couldn't pull the strings with her.
With her, yeah. As could no one else.
Right.
I mean, she really had her own ideas. And the sort of nerve she had to just, well, I think I'll go check out this next city and see what the situation is. Maybe people need hair products there too. And she sort of reinvented herself several times, and in the process.
Definitely, she is really it's the great American self-transformation. It's so much a part of the stories of really successful Americans historically. And she was born in Louisiana, lived in Vicksburg after her parents died when she was 7, lived with her sister, moved up the river to St. Louis, was in a bad marriage, and then left St. Louis and went to Denver, where she had a sister-in-law and nieces, and then after she remarried there, then she and the husband began to travel all around the country. And she really was fearless in this way. She even went to Central America and the Caribbean in 1913 to sell her products. There was nothing that she was going to let stand in her way after she had overcome all of these early losses.
And that was the other thing that was a myth that I always heard, was that she had married her money, that C.J. Walker was the money, and that's not true at all.
Oh, no. She told this story. She said, when we began to make $10 a week, my husband thought that was enough and I should be satisfied. And due to his narrowness of vision, we parted ways. So he didn't have as much ambition as she had.
No, and boy, did she have ambition.
Right.
She really, and vision.
Right.
And her sort of responsibility to the community. She gave a check for $1,000 to the YMCA, am I saying that right?
This was in 1911, and $1,000 would have been at that point equivalent to maybe $20,000.
Yes.
She contributed this amount to the Black YMCA in Indianapolis. And then in 1919, just before she died, she contributed $5,000 to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund. That was the largest gift the NAACP had ever received.
Wow, wow. Yeah, so she was really a philanthropist, an activist, and then she also did hair.
And she also did hair, right. And she did help transform the way that black women viewed themselves. Many people focus on the straightening hair, but she was trying to grow hair, and hygiene was so different at the time. She encouraged people to wash their hair more often, and they could throw away the hair pieces once their hair began to grow back. It really lent some glamour to black women, and I think she'd actually be pretty happy these days to see the wide range of hairstyles that we have.
Yeah, we have a few more options these days. So. Right. You also include her daughter, Lilia, and her Lelia's adopted
Right.
May.
Right.
Just could you say just a little bit?
Well, Alelia Walker, Madam's daughter, was the apple of her eye. That was the motivation for her to improve her life. And Alelia lived a glamorous life. After her mother died, she was the toast of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes called her the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s because of the great parties that she gave. And everybody from Duke Ellington to Langston Hughes to Zora Neale Hurston would be at the parties. Alelia was married 3 times and had no biological children. She adopted May, who was my grandmother. And May had braids long enough to sit on. A lot of Native American and African American genealogy in her family. And the main product for Madam Walker was a wonderful hair grower. And May was a model for Madam Walker, traveled around the country with her.
And the pictures of her, you resemble her so closely, but they're such dramatic, the braids, the black Rapunzel, is that what
That's right, right. That's
you know,
right.
she really, it's a wonderful, and we are out of time, but the whole metaphor of hair and empowerment, of strength and power and reaching out is really clear in this book, so thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks to Alelia Bundles for joining me in the coffee house. Again, her new book is On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block. Thank you.
They are the invisible poets of America's 19th century. Over 130 black men and women published some 90 volumes of pamphlets of poetry and hundreds of poems in black periodicals, but their achievements remain unacknowledged. This program, the second in a series of 3, focuses on the American postbellum black.
George Moses Horton was the first slave to protest bondage in verse. He was intent on a professional literary career in a society that denied him the right to write.
I feel myself in need of the inspiring strains of ancient lore. My heart to lift, my empty mind to feed, and all the world explore.
And all the world explore.
I know that I am old.
I know that I am old and never
never
can recover what is past.
But for the future,
But for
may
the
some
future,
light unfold
may some light
and soar
unfold
from ages
and
blast.
soar from ages blast.
My genius from a
My
boy
genius
has
from a
fluttered
boy
like a bird
has fluttered
within my
like a
heart.
bird within my heart.
But could not thus confine her powers employ,
impatient to depart.
She like a restless
She
bird
like a restless
would
bird
spread her wings,
would spread her
power
wings,
to be
her
unfurled,
power to be unfurled,
and let her songs be loudly heard,
and dart from world to world. The next day in Malden town, who should I see but Master? He says, Jack, you must go home. You'll starve and freeze to death, sir. Says I, you are a nice old man, very kind and clever, but think I'll wear my chains again. No, master, never.
My country, 'tis of thee, dark land of slavery. In thee we groan. Long have our chains been worn. Long has our grief been born. Our flesh has even been torn from our bones.
From every mountain
No.
side,
The time has come when we must not be dumb. We must awake.
My country,
we now 8 million strong must strike sweet freedom song and plead ourselves our wrong. Our chains must break. Our chains must break. Our chains must break.
Every mountainside, let freedom ring. Simpson, a poet of poignant and witty anti-slavery songs, he sang what would be death to speak.
Aubrey Olson Whitman, the Romantic poet, urges white Americans to acknowledge the Negro's role in the country's history. He says, "I was born in bondage. I was never a slave." He wrote Custer's Last Ride for the Zanesville Courier.
Faith on the fatal morn, proud as the waves of horn, rode the cavalier, followed by gallant men, far in a rocky glen to disappear. Stand, cries their Custer proud, stand in the battle cloud, echoes high around, answers the saber's stroke, oh, in black waves of smoke, his fair form's drowned. No more their leader calls, pierced mid his men he falls, but sinks breathing stand, and where the hero lies, each soldier till he dies, fights hand to hand. Benjamin Clark, a fugitive slave, writes of cruelties of the white man against the black man down through history and evaluates the status of the American postbellum black. In his poem, The Seminole, he tells of Osceola, who married the daughter of a fugitive Negro slave and was ambushed under a flag of truce.
Bold champion of a noble race, who never feared the pale man's face, or nation trieds thou to disgrace, or name of Seminole. But ah, the fatal moment, when thou placed reliance on the men who, under a flag of truce, did then deceive thee, Osceola. Fame will record it to the shame of those who planned and those who came to desecrate fair freedom's name by robbing Seminole.
That's it for this time. See you next time in the Coffee House.
I went back to school for him.
We're learning to use computers together.
I love being able to read to my grandchildren. It's never too late to get an education.
Hi, I'm calling to register for the GED classes, and there's someone else who wants to sign up with me. My dad.
Helping your family begins with helping yourself. To find out about adult education classes in your community, call Literacy Works today.
You know, life has as many opportunities as there are stars in the sky.
I want to go into space.
1. Ignition and liftoff.
Modify the beta angle and give us another 4 or 5 seconds coming up. I see the execute. Okay.
I want to report weather on TV.
Numerous tornadoes may occur.
There's a 60% chance we'll have 4 more inches.
Storm patterns moving quickly in a north.
I want to make special effects.
We use math every day in countless ways. It's in our lives, it's everywhere. Math, it's our future. The more mathematics we know, the more opportunities we'll have.
Only young people get cavities, right? So there's no need for seniors to use a fluoride toothpaste, right? Wrong on both counts. Municipalities began adding fluoride to their public water supply back in 1946. Fluoride toothpaste went on the market in the 60s. Since then, fluoride has helped millions of people of all ages avoid tooth decay. The operative words here are people of all ages. Aging means we need to take better care of our teeth. That's because receding gums make tooth roots more susceptible to plaque and tooth decay. Many adults have some form of gum disease, a major cause of tooth loss among adults. If your gums are red, swollen, tender, or bleed easily, see your dentist. And don't forget to keep brushing with a fluoride toothpaste. For the ADA Dental Minute, I'm Dr. Maria Lopez Howell.